The sea heaved under steel. Engines roared against waves. Salt spray lashed across faces as an armada advanced. The sound was not one ship, not a dozen. It was thousands. The horizon itself moved forward, thick with hulls and masts and funnels. Smoke trailed like black ribbons in the morning sky. The smell of diesel and cordite carried across the channel, coating tongues with grit. It was June 6, 1944, and the impossible was happening. In one single day, more than 150,000 men would cross the water and put boots on French soil. Never before in history had so many soldiers moved in one coordinated strike. German generals, who had laughed at America as a nation of amateurs, now stared at reconnaissance reports in disbelief. Could the enemy really land an army larger than many entire campaigns in just 24 hours? The answer came with the thunder of guns. At dawn, Allied warships opened fire. 8-inch and 14-inch naval guns hurled shells inland, shaking earth and sky. Each explosion punched holes into German strongpoints, blowing apart concrete and steel. Villages trembled as centuries-old walls cracked under the weight of modern war. Farmers miles inland heard the bombardment and thought the world was ending. The ground itself seemed to roar. German commanders who believed America could not organize watched 150,000 men coordinate across sea and air as if it were a drill. Underestimation was finished. Confrontation had arrived. Planning had begun years earlier. The Allies had amassed more than 5,000 vessels, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, transports. Some ships were only 30 meters long, designed to scrape onto sandbars and drop ramps for tanks. Others were massive transports, each carrying hundreds of soldiers in tight rows. Together, they formed the largest invasion fleet ever assembled. The Channel looked like you could walk to France on ships alone, one sailor wrote. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The mathematics of the operation were staggering. 150,000 men, 50,000 vehicles, 11,000 aircraft overhead. In one morning, the Allies landed more men than Germany had used to invade France in 1940. It was not just an assault. It was industrial might expressed in bodies and steel. German intelligence officers who had predicted at most 20,000 men gasped as reports flowed in. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, all filled with waves of landing craft. The first waves hit beaches under fire. Machine guns raked the water. Mortar rounds splashed geysers among the craft. Men leapt into surf, rifles held above their heads, packs dragging them down. The sea tasted of salt and iron. Many drowned before firing a shot. But still they came, wave after wave, line after line, filling the sand with bodies and steel. German generals had trusted the Atlantic Wall. Hundreds of bunkers, millions of mines, thousands of guns. But the numbers betrayed them. A wall that might stop tens of thousands could not stop 150,000 in a single day. The scale itself broke the logic of defense. We thought they could never sustain it, Field Marshal von Rundstedt later said. We were wrong. BBC interview, 1962. From the German perspective, disbelief hardened into panic. Telephones rang in bunkers. Reports shouted over static. One colonel insisted the landings were a feint. Another argued they must be limited. But scouts along the beaches described endless streams of craft, endless columns of men, endless shadows of aircraft overhead. It was not a landing, one officer admitted afterward. It was an eruption. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Smoke thickened until daylight dimmed. Sand stuck to sweat, grinding into wounds. The crash of shells never paused, rolling like thunder across the coast. German gunners coughed on cordite as they fired until barrels glowed red. Soldiers shouted over the roar, voices shredded by fear. The sea itself seemed alive, vomiting men and machines without end. One sector of Omaha Beach saw 34,000 men land by nightfall. Utah, 23,000. Gold, 25,000. Juno, 21,000. Sword, 29,000. German officers added the totals with trembling hands. By midnight, 156,000 Allied troops had crossed the Channel. It was as if an entire nation had moved in one day. International law recognized the right of invasion in war, but had no framework for its scale. Geneva regulated prisoners, civilians, even weapons. But it had nothing to say about an army larger than some nations moving in a single tide. Was it warfare? Or something new? industrial annihilation by logistics. Historians debate still. They needed reserves, but reserves were trapped inland by Allied air power. Bridges lay in ruins from months of bombing. Trains never arrived. Convoys were strafed by fighters that seemed to own the sky. Men who might have reinforced the beaches instead crouched in ditches, bombed before they could move. The scale of the landing combined with the scale of the air assault to paralyze German response. One captured officer later confessed, "It was not bravery that defeated us. It was mathematics. They had more ships, more planes, more men than we could comprehend." Red Cross Report, 1945. German coastal commanders peered through binoculars and saw not scattered craft, but layers of assault. First came the landing craft, stubby, square-bowed, each spilling men into surf. Behind them rode larger vessels, disgorging tanks whose exhaust curled black against gray skies. And farther out, beyond the reach of coastal guns, floated battleships that hurled shells the weight of automobiles into French soil. The sea was not background. It was the battlefield itself, carrying death in waves. By mid-morning, the numbers had grown incomprehensible. Reports estimated 4,000 landing craft in operation, with more queuing behind. Each hour brought another 10,000 men onto beaches already clogged with steel and smoke. German generals, trained to calculate balance of force, saw their arithmetic collapse. No reserve, no bunker, no gun line could stop a human tide of this magnitude. Inside bunkers, phones shrieked. One officer shouted that his regiment was down to half strength. Another reported that tanks sent to repel the invasion had been destroyed before reaching the shore. "Every road is under air attack," he said. Luftwaffe support, once promised, was absent. Allied fighters swarmed skies in formations of hundreds. German gunners who looked up saw contrails stretching like white rivers from horizon to horizon. Concrete bunkers rattled under naval shells. Plaster dust fell from ceilings, choking men at their machine guns. Eyes burned from cordite fumes. Ears rang with concussions so constant that silence itself became unthinkable. It was like fighting inside a thunderstorm that never ended, one German soldier later recalled. U.S. National Archives, 1946. At Omaha Beach, the blood toll was immediate. Hundreds of Americans died in the surf, dragged down by gear or torn apart by fire. Yet for every man who fell, another 10 followed. German defenders, firing until barrels smoked, realized the logic of defense was broken. They could kill thousands, but still tens of thousands more came. A corporal muttered as he reloaded, "We are drowning in enemies." By noon, 75,000 Allied troops had landed. By sunset, over 150,000. This was not just a battle. It was the physical manifestation of American industry. Liberty ships had crossed the Atlantic carrying supplies enough for weeks. Tank landing ships rolled Sherman tanks onto sandbars. Engineers built piers out of steel caissons dragged across the channel. Within hours of securing beaches, Americans unloaded bulldozers, trucks, crates of ammunition. German commanders watching through binoculars felt madness creep in. This was not an army improvising. This was an army building a continent from scratch. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, absent on June 6th due to a trip to Germany, had warned earlier that the Allies would bring overwhelming force. "Their material superiority will decide the battle within hours," he wrote to his staff. Yet even Rommel underestimated the scale. When he returned to his command post and saw reports of 150,000 troops ashore, his face reportedly hardened. "The war is lost," he told aides. BBC interview, 1962. In 1940, Germany had invaded France with 135,000 men on the first day. Now, in 1944, America alone landed more than that in 24 hours. Add British and Canadian forces, and the balance was overwhelming. German generals understood the symbolism. America had rewritten the equation of war. The smell of smoke and burning fuel clung to every breeze. Men on both sides coughed through it, tasting metal on their tongues. Beaches were littered with wreckage. Burned-out landing craft, shattered tanks, lifeless bodies washed in with tide. Yet behind the carnage lay order. Allied engineers moved with efficiency, clearing mines, marking lanes, directing vehicles ashore. German officers admitted later, "We thought chaos would undo them. Instead, they turned chaos into rhythm." Red Cross Report, 1945. By midnight, the beachheads held. Thousands of wounded filled makeshift hospitals. Supply depots sprouted behind dunes. Trucks rolled forward, headlights dimmed but rolling nonetheless. The unimaginable had happened. An entire army had materialized across the channel in one day. Night settled over Normandy, but the beaches did not rest. Floodlights swung across the surf. Engines never stopped. Cranes lifted crates from barges. Bulldozers growled as they pushed wreckage aside and flattened sand for roads. German officers staring through field glasses could scarcely believe what they saw. The enemy was not clinging to a fragile beachhead. He was already building a port. By dawn on June 7th, more than 2,500 tons of equipment had already come ashore. Trucks by the hundreds rolled off ships. Field kitchens boiled coffee for divisions that had landed only hours earlier. Ammunition dumps grew behind dunes like hills of steel. One captured German officer told interrogators, "We thought they would need weeks. They did it in hours." U.S. National Archives, 1946. For the men defending strongpoints, the assault continued without pause. The horizon glowed orange from fires. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and the sour tang of cordite. The crash of artillery never ceased. Even at night, naval guns reached inland to batter crossroads and villages. German troops, huddled in trenches, shivered not from cold, but from realization. The invasion was irreversible. Orders crackled across phones. Send the 21st Panzer. Send reserves from Caen. But Allied aircraft prowled roads relentlessly. Columns of half-tracks and fuel trucks burst into flame before reaching the front. Villagers hiding in cellars reported the same scene again and again. Convoys reduced to twisted metal by strafing fighters. German generals realized reserves were not only delayed, they were destroyed before arrival. One diary recovered from a staff officer near Caen captured the despair. "Every bridge is gone. Every road is under fire. We are blind under their aircraft. Our men cannot move. This is not war. It is extermination by machines." Red Cross Report, 1945. In 1940, Germany had marched through France in weeks, boasting of speed and surprise. In 1944, America reversed the script, landing more men in one day than Germany had moved in some entire offensives. The Blitzkrieg had been answered by something larger, an industrial tidal wave. Prisoners captured on June 6 described the roar of ships so loud it shook the ground, the sky dark with planes until daylight dimmed, the endless tramp of boots on sand. One sergeant muttered during interrogation, "It was like watching a new continent arrive." By the end of June 6th, Allied forces had landed 57,500 Americans on Utah and Omaha, 83,115 British and Canadians on Gold, Juno, and Sword, and 23,000 airborne troops behind lines. The total, more than 163,000 men in the first 24 hours, exceeding even the boldest predictions. German generals had measured war in regiments and divisions. America measured in nations. A single day had erased years of propaganda. "We told our soldiers America could not fight," one general later admitted. "On that day, we learned the truth." BBC interview, 1962. The shock was not merely the presence of enemy soldiers, but the arithmetic of their arrival. In a single day, 150,000 troops crossed the channel and carved a foothold that no counterattack could erase. German generals who once dismissed America as incapable now faced a reality so vast that it changed not only a battle, but the trajectory of the war itself. The beaches were no longer just strips of sand. By dawn on June 7th, they had become sprawling cities of war. Trucks rumbled off landing craft and fanned inland. Engineers in khaki drove bulldozers that pushed sand into ramps and filled craters left by artillery. Behind them, cranes swung crates of ammunition onto cleared ground. The order was relentless. Every hour, another 2,000 tons of supplies piled up behind dunes. For German commanders, the real shock came not from the landing itself, but from what followed. An army that had seemed vulnerable in surf now expanded like floodwater. Within a single day, the Allies carved 5 beachheads into connected footholds. German staff officers staring at maps realized that these were not lodgements. They were foundations for an entire front. Reports streamed into Corps headquarters. At Omaha, where resistance had been fiercest, more than 34,000 Americans had forced their way inland. At Utah, another 23,000 moved steadily toward causeways. British divisions at Gold and Sword pushed toward Bayeux and Caen. Canadians at Juno had secured villages despite heavy losses. Altogether, more than 150,000 men now stood on French soil, and by nightfall that number would grow closer to 163,000. German generals who had laughed at America's supposed softness now confronted the arithmetic of invasion. They had not been met with a raid. They had been met with an avalanche. Inside bunkers, the contrast between belief and reality deepened despair. A colonel on the Calvados coast phoned divisional headquarters. "We are being overrun. They keep coming. Every road is blocked with their vehicles." Static cut his words, but the message was clear. There was no pause. Prisoners captured on D-Day told interrogators, "The seas seem to grow men." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The sensory weight of combat never lifted. Machine guns rattled until barrels warped. Mortars thumped from foxholes dug into chalk soil. The air smelled of cordite and burning oil. Wounded men cried from gullies, their voices drowned by naval barrages. German soldiers stumbled across sand coated with seaweed, smoke, and blood. The very texture of the ground was alien now, clogged with shell casings, fragments of steel, twisted barbed wire. By midday, June 7th, Allied numbers doubled again. More than 300,000 tons of supplies had been landed. Engineers assembled prefabricated piers known as mulberries. Sections floated across the channel and were sunk into place, creating harbors where none had existed. German reconnaissance planes that managed to evade Allied fighters photographed these structures. Generals who saw the images felt their stomachs sink. "They have brought ports with them," one officer exclaimed. "We cannot dislodge them." The arithmetic was merciless. In less than 48 hours, America and its allies had moved more men and equipment than Germany could assemble for counterattack in weeks. Even panzer divisions, once the terror of Europe, could not reach the front intact. Allied air patrols tore them apart on open roads. Tank crews who once thundered across steppes now crouched in hedgerows, waiting for night to move. In Berlin, the mood curdled. Reports from Normandy contradicted propaganda. Joseph Goebbels had promised that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that any landing would be thrown back into the sea. But dispatches spoke of Allied soldiers already pushing inland, already linking beaches. "The wall has failed," a general admitted in a private note later recovered after the war. Red Cross Report, 1945. The shock was not only material, but psychological. German troops, drilled to expect weakness, now faced men who advanced even under slaughter. At Omaha Beach alone, nearly 3,000 Americans died or were wounded in the first hours. Yet battalions kept pushing, company after company climbing bluffs under fire. One German defender, later captured, admitted, "We thought the slaughter would break them. It did not. They climbed over their own dead to reach us." For commanders, every assumption collapsed. They had believed logistics would limit the Allies. They had believed weather would break them. They had believed that an invasion of this scale could not be sustained. Now they saw trucks rolling ashore, fuel flowing from drums, tanks lining up in neat rows. The invasion was not a desperate gamble. It was a demonstration of inexhaustible power. A staff officer at 7th Army headquarters near Le Mans scribbled in his log, "They fight with machines, with ships, with numbers we cannot match. It is not a battle. It is an occupation unfolding in hours." His words were not exaggeration. By the second night, Allied troops held a line more than 40 kilometers wide. The sky buzzed with C-47 transport planes, their drone constant like bees over fields. The taste of dust coated every mouth as artillery churned roads into powder. Nights glowed red with burning villages. The weight of tanks pressed into earth, leaving ruts deeper than plow furrows. Soldiers described the ground as if it were groaning beneath iron. By June 8th, nearly 260,000 Allied troops were ashore. In 2 days, more men had landed in France than Germany had ever placed in Norway, Denmark, or Holland during entire invasions. The scale stunned even Allied officers. General Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "We have created a front in one stroke." U.S. National Archives, 1946. For German generals, the realization was worse. A front could be fought, a continent could not. The morning of June 8th began with German orders for counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen, finally received clearance to move. Columns of tanks rolled onto roads lined with hedgerows. Their engines growled, exhaust stung eyes. Treads clattered over bridges. Yet before they advanced 10 kilometers, Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Typhoons dove from clouds, rockets streaking down. Trucks burst into fireballs. Half-tracks twisted like tin. Tank crews bailed out into ditches, choking on smoke. The road to the beaches had become a killing ground. German generals who had once boasted of blitzkrieg now felt its reversal. Speed no longer belonged to them. The Allies moved faster, not by road but by sky and sea. Supplies poured across beaches without pause. By June 8th, Allied engineers had built more than 20 miles of temporary roads. Jeeps and trucks sped inland, hauling fuel, ammunition, food. German convoys struggled to move at all. Every daylight hour meant exposure to strafing. Even night brought little relief. Bombers prowled skies in constant rotation. The imbalance of numbers grew sharper. At Caen, the Germans managed to push some Allied units back, but resistance was fragmented. At each village, British and Canadian infantry held firm, supported by armor that kept arriving in waves. German commanders realized they were fighting not against a beachhead, but against a machine. For every tank destroyed, another seemed to roll ashore. For every company repelled, 2 more replaced it. Letters captured from American soldiers revealed confidence that stunned German interrogators. One corporal wrote home, "We have more food than we can eat, more shells than we can fire, more men than we can count." German staff compared it to their own soldiers' letters, describing shortages of fuel, of ammunition, of bread. The psychological gap widened with every page. By June 9th, German command acknowledged reality. Rundstedt telephoned Berlin. "The only course left is to make peace." Hitler refused, insisting reserves from the east would turn the tide. But divisions never arrived. Trains delayed by bombed tracks. Bridges collapsed by Allied raids. Trucks empty for lack of fuel. The Reich could move battalions on maps, but not in reality. On the ground, German soldiers fought with grim discipline. In hedgerows, machine gunners waited until Allied columns passed, then opened fire from flanks. Mortars pounded crossroads. Snipers stalked lanes. Yet the weight of numbers crushed resistance. For every ambush, Allied artillery replied with overwhelming barrages. Fields disappeared under smoke and flame. One village shelled for 30 minutes no longer had walls standing. Survivors described it as erasure by steel. German generals at Caen watched reports pile in. One battalion at half strength, another reduced to a company. Reserves pinned before contact. Officers whispered what none dared to write. The battle was already lost. What remained was only time. By June 10th, Allied strength had grown beyond imagination. Nearly 330,000 troops stood in Normandy. Tanks numbered in the thousands, vehicles in the tens of thousands. Fuel depots bulged with drums. Field hospitals treated wounded by the thousands daily, yet replacements arrived as quickly as casualties fell. German divisions opposite them shrank hourly, their ranks hollowed by losses and isolation. The rumble of artillery was constant day and night, shaking earth like an endless earthquake. The air reeked of smoke, of fuel, of blood. Roads were lined with dead horses, overturned wagons, burning vehicles. Prisoners captured by Allies were stunned by the abundance they saw even in combat zones. Their soldiers carried more food in their packs than we received in a week, one POW admitted. Red Cross Report 1945. For the generals, each new report was a dagger. They had underestimated, then confronted. Now they endured consequences. The truth was undeniable. America had not only landed 150,000 men in a day, it had sustained them, expanded them, multiplied them, until the invasion became permanent. The beaches had become a bridge, and the bridge led straight into the heart of France. June 11th brought new attempts at German counterattack. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, formed from Hitler Youth, pushed toward Allied positions near Caen. Teenagers in black uniforms rode tanks forward, faces taut, eyes wide. They fought with fanatic energy, firing Panzerfausts from hedgerows, charging machine guns with grenades in their fists. For a moment, British lines buckled. Villages changed hands in brutal close combat. But then the artillery spoke. Hundreds of guns opened at once, flattening streets, silencing machine gun nests, shattering stone. Survivors crawled back through fields, leaving burning wrecks behind. No bravery could match the mathematics. Courage filled trenches, but courage did not replace tanks. Determination fired rifles, but determination did not silence battleships. Each day, the Allies landed another 20,000 men and thousands of tons of supplies. Each day, German divisions shrank. By the end of the first week, Allied strength in Normandy reached more than 325,000 men. Over 50,000 vehicles crowded roads, 100,000 tons of ammunition stacked behind lines. German reserves amounted to fragments, divisions in name only, short of fuel, short of men, short of hope. We had battalions of paper, not battalions of soldiers, one officer later confessed. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The contrasts told the same story. Allied trucks rolled endlessly, engines humming, headlights blacked out but moving without pause. German carts creaked in mud, horses dying in harness, drivers staring at skies they no longer owned. The smell of Allied coffee drifted through villages. German soldiers chewed crusts of bread gone stale. The ground itself bore witness. Allied boots tramped in waves across fields. German stragglers left lonely footprints retreating toward forests. By mid-June, the shock among German generals was complete. What had begun as disbelief at the landing had become recognition of collapse. They had underestimated the American. They had underestimated their industry, their logistics, their will. Now they faced the consequence. An invasion that grew larger every hour. An enemy that seemed inexhaustible. A front that could not be restored. One captured officer, asked to describe his thoughts on June 6th, replied simply, "It was the day I understood the war was over." Red Cross Report, 1945. His words carried the weight of truth that maps and numbers already made plain. The first clash in Normandy had not only opened a new front, it had opened German eyes to a reality they had refused to see. America was not soft, not unprepared, not incapable. America was relentless, and in a single day, it had delivered the proof in steel, blood, and numbers that could not be denied. By the second week of June, the invasion beaches had ceased to be beaches. They were ports, airfields, depots, factories without walls. Where once waves lapped against sand, now steel piers jutted into the channel. Barges unloaded jeeps, trucks, artillery pieces. Cranes lifted Sherman tanks onto temporary docks, their treads squealing as they rolled toward hedgerows. The rhythm of the sea had been replaced by the rhythm of engines. German reconnaissance flights, those few that survived the gauntlet of Allied fighters, reported images that stunned headquarters. Endless rows of supply dumps spread inland, tarpaulins covering mountains of crates. Bulldozers worked day and night, carving roads out of farmland. One pilot, forced to turn back under fire, told his commander, "It is not a camp. It is a country forming in front of us." U.S. National Archives, 1946. Numbers proved him right. By June 12th, over 326,000 Allied soldiers had landed, along with 54,000 vehicles and more than 100,000 tons of supplies. In less than a week, the Allies had delivered enough to sustain entire armies for months. German generals who had calculated that logistics would choke the invaders now saw those calculations inverted. The bottleneck was theirs, not the enemy's. The sensory environment reflected the scale. Roads thundered under wheels, the smell of fuel and oil heavy in the air. Dust coated helmets and uniforms as convoys rolled without pause. At night, floodlights burned over piers, their beams slicing through fog. The channel itself glowed with the lanterns of ships, a floating city that never slept. German officers watching from distance described it as a machine that ate the sea and spat out armies. Attempts at disruption failed. Luftwaffe bombers, few in number, tried to strike at the Mulberry harbors. Anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols swatted them down. German submarines lurked offshore, but destroyers hunted them with relentless sonar sweeps. Mines planted along approaches were cleared by Allied minesweepers. Every obstacle was anticipated, countered, overwhelmed. On the ground, Allied troops pushed beyond beaches. Villages fell one by one as infantry advanced through hedgerows. Each field became a fortress, walled by earth and roots centuries old. Germans fought bitterly from these green walls, but the Allies adapted quickly. Engineers mounted saw-toothed blades on tanks to crash through hedges. Infantry worked with armor in tight coordination. "They learned faster than we expected," one German officer admitted in post-war interrogation. Red Cross Report, 1945. The contrast in supply lines widened. German convoys crawled along cratered roads, their trucks starving for fuel. Horses pulled wagons with dwindling shells. Allied convoys, by comparison, rolled with clockwork precision. Each jeep carried jerry cans of gasoline. Each truck hauled crates of ammunition or food. Soldiers joked they were eating better in Normandy than they had in England. For German troops crouched in foxholes with half rations, the difference was unbearable. Eisenhower's staff called it the miracle of logistics, but it was not miracle. It was mathematics. Allied industry had built Liberty ships at a rate of 1 every 4 days. American factories produced 50,000 jeeps and 30,000 tanks in a year. Canneries packed millions of rations, from meat stew to powdered coffee. German officers who captured abandoned Allied supply crates marveled at their abundance. Every box was full, one recalled. For us, boxes were often half empty. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The sensory richness of Allied camps underlined the disparity. Fires crackled as kitchens brewed coffee that carried a rich aroma across hedgerows. Chocolate circulated in ration packs. Cigarettes were plentiful, smoke curling above trenches. German soldiers who surrendered often gawked at these luxuries before touching the ground in relief. One POW told interrogators, "We thought they had warehouses without end." By mid-June, Allied commanders linked beachheads into a continuous front. Bayeux had fallen, Caen was threatened, Carentan linked Utah and Omaha. The front stretched more than 60 kilometers, and behind it stood an ocean of reserves. German generals, counting divisions on their maps, realized they had no way to seal the gap. What they faced was not just invasion, but multiplication. Each day the enemy grew stronger, while their own strength eroded. The reality pressed hardest on communications. German officers struggled to coordinate under bombardment. Wires were cut, radios jammed, messengers killed on roads, orders lagged by hours, sometimes by days. Allies, in contrast, laid field telephones as they advanced, radios buzzing in jeeps, signals flowing across channel cables. American divisions could request artillery in minutes. German units begged for fuel and ammunition that never came. By June 14th, American engineers had laid a temporary airstrip near Omaha. Fighters landed, refueled, and took off again within hours. The front was no longer dependent solely on Britain. The war had crossed the Channel completely. It was as if they had transplanted their homeland into France, one captured German officer later said. BBC interview, 1962. Even the weather favored them. Storms struck the Channel in mid-June, damaging one Mulberry Harbor. Yet supplies kept flowing through the other, and even directly onto beaches. German intelligence predicted disaster. Instead, Allied soldiers joked as they dragged crates through surf, laughing at waves. A sergeant quipped, "The sea can't stop us. Only the enemy can, and they aren't doing it." The shock within German high command deepened. Hitler raged at reports, accusing commanders of cowardice. Rundstedt argued for retreat to more defensible lines. Rommel insisted on immediate counterattacks. But neither strategy mattered. Without fuel, without air cover, without control of the sea, their words were empty. They were fighting against not just an army, but an entire industrial system that had learned to project itself across oceans. By June 15th, nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers were in Normandy. More than 60,000 vehicles clogged roads. Supply dumps grew so vast that reconnaissance pilots mistook them for towns. Ammunition expenditure dwarfed anything Germany could match. Allied artillery fired 200,000 shells in a single day. German batteries managed a fraction of that. The imbalance was visible in every skirmish. German generals who had once laughed at American inexperience now whispered of American relentlessness. What they faced was not just courage, but machinery fueled by factories an ocean away. They had expected a raid, a collapse, a retreat. Instead, they faced a tide that grew higher each morning. By the middle of June, the landings had transformed into a permanent front. The once fragile strip of sand was now a fortress, spreading inland with every hour. Allied artillery batteries dug into fields, their barrels camouflaged with branches, their shells stacked in pyramids. Trucks carried ammunition ceaselessly, engines humming, drivers gulping coffee as they rolled along narrow lanes. German spotters who risked a glance from ruined farmhouses saw not chaos but a system, an industrial rhythm transplanted onto French soil. The German generals who had mocked American soldiers as untrained and soft now studied reports in silence. At Carentan, paratroopers had seized causeways under fire, holding them until reinforcements linked beaches. At Bayeux, British divisions marched in column, banners flying, tanks clattering over cobblestones. At Caen, though resistance stiffened, the Allies poured in artillery and armor as if supply were infinite. "They come as if from a factory," one colonel wrote in a diary recovered after the war. U.S. National Archives, 1946. German soldiers crouched in trenches with rusting rifles, listening to the endless drone of Allied planes. The smell of exhaust and cordite never left the air. Nights glowed with burning barns, mornings shook with shell fire. Meanwhile, Allied troops brewed coffee, opened canned rations, lit cigarettes with steady hands. POWs captured in these days told interrogators that the sight of American abundance had been as crushing as the sight of American tanks. By June 16th, more than 450,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. Over 70,000 vehicles crowded roads. Ammunition expenditure exceeded 20,000 tons. The Mulberry harbors processed hundreds of ships a day. One engineer recorded, "We unload faster than the Germans can destroy." German staff who read intercepted reports could not believe the pace. For them, supply had always been measured in scarcity. For the Allies, it was measured in surplus. The 2nd Panzer Division moved from the interior, but its convoys burned on roads bombed by fighter bombers. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers tried to strike near Carentan, but they faced paratroopers supported by artillery so thick it turned fields into moonscapes. Survivors stumbled back through hedgerows, their units reduced to fractions. Commanders noted that battles lasted hours, not days. Against overwhelming fire, resistance collapsed like glass under hammers. German generals pleaded for reserves. They begged for divisions from the east, for fuel from dwindling depots, for Luftwaffe squadrons that no longer existed. The Reich answered with speeches, not soldiers. Hitler's orders were fanatical. Hold every inch, fight to the last, no retreat. But maps told the truth. Every day the front widened. Every day the enemy grew. Every day their own ranks shrank. Horses pulled guns along muddy tracks, hooves slipping, eyes wide with fear at the roar of Allied aircraft overhead. Soldiers clutched carbines that jammed from overuse, hands trembling with exhaustion. Meanwhile, Allied convoys rolled in endless streams, engines steady, headlights dark, but movement unbroken even at night. The difference was visible in the dirt beneath boots. Germans left scattered footprints. Allies pressed entire highways into new roads. Prisoners captured in hedgerows spoke of despair. "We cannot match their numbers," one lieutenant admitted. "Every time we kill 10, 100 more arrive." His words echoed across interrogations, repeated by officers and privates alike. Red Cross Report, 1945. By June 18th, the front was irreversible. Nearly 500,000 Allied soldiers stood in Normandy. 2 Mulberry harbors processed cargo at a rate unmatched by any port in occupied Europe. Airfields sprouted behind beaches, their runways cut into fields where wheat had grown weeks before. Fighters landed, refueled, and lifted off again, hunting German convoys before they reached the line. The Germans had believed the Channel would protect them. Instead, the Channel had delivered a machine of war they could not comprehend. Generals gathered in chateaus turned headquarters. Maps spread across oak tables. They pointed to villages, to rivers, to roads, but none of their markers mattered. Reports contradicted plans within hours. Communications lagged behind the speed of collapse. Rommel himself drove through Normandy, seeing convoys of Allied trucks rolling without pause. He returned to headquarters and admitted, "The war is lost unless we end it now." BBC interview, 1962. His words carried more fear than anger. Allied ships crossed the Channel with such frequency that sailors joked it was a ferry service. German U-boats sank a few, but replacements filled the gap instantly. Mines destroyed landing craft, but more arrived in their place. The Reich had no answer to a system that could rebuild faster than it was destroyed. Dust clouds rose over roads as Allied columns marched. The air tasted of fuel and smoke, of iron and sweat. Nights thundered with artillery that never paused. German soldiers wrote home of a sky that never grew quiet, a ground that never stilled, a war that never gave them rest. By the 3rd week of June, the invasion had become transformation. Normandy was no longer occupied territory. It was Allied territory, defended not by fragile lodgements but by mass. Generals who once mocked America now understood they had underestimated not just a nation, but a continent. By June 20th, German generals were forced to admit the unthinkable. The invasion had not been slowed, not even stalled for a day. Instead, it expanded with each sunrise. Reports showed Allied divisions linking arms across Normandy, building a front deeper and wider than expected. What was supposed to be a fragile bridgehead had become an iron wall. At Caen, fighting raged with ferocity. Panzer divisions hurled themselves against British lines, tanks dueling across wheat fields, shells shrieking, earth erupting in fountains of dirt. For hours, German crews believed they might drive the enemy back. But then artillery from offshore joined in. Battleships firing from 20 miles out, their shells landing with the weight of locomotives. The ground quaked, and the attack collapsed. Survivors retreated, leaving fields strewn with wreckage. One commander admitted, "We had never fought an enemy whose guns reached from land and sea together." U.S. National Archives, 1946. In the West, American forces pushed through hedgerows, every lane contested. German defenders fought hard, but they faced divisions that rotated men, that ate full meals, that never ran out of ammunition. American soldiers advanced behind tanks modified with steel prongs to cut through hedges. Each adaptation neutralized German defenses. What once seemed impregnable became another obstacle to be bulldozed. By June 21st, more than 500,000 Allied soldiers were ashore. Nearly 80,000 vehicles clogged roads, from jeeps to Sherman tanks to artillery tractors. Ammunition dumps sprawled like cities of crates, guarded by sentries smoking cigarettes in the glow of lanterns. German generals compared these figures to their own dwindling forces. Divisions reduced to half strength, artillery batteries with a handful of shells. Allied engines drummed without pause, convoys raising dust that coated hedgerows. German lines smelled of damp earth, cordite, and decay. The sky overhead buzzed with Allied aircraft from dawn to dusk, their silhouettes black against the sun. German soldiers knew even their shadows betrayed them. One officer captured near Carentan told interrogators, "We fought, but the war had already ended on June 6th. We did not know it, but it was true." Red Cross Report, 1945. His statement echoed what many generals already believed. The landing had not been a battle. It had been a verdict. By the last week of June, the Allied foothold was no longer measured in kilometers of beach. It was measured in divisions, in corps, in armies. German command could not dislodge it, could not contain it, could barely comprehend it. The invasion had become permanent, and with permanence came inevitability. The shock that had begun on June 6th did not fade. It deepened with each passing day. German generals who once laughed at America now faced the truth carved into the soil of Normandy. 150,000 men in a single day had changed the war, and no strategy could turn it back. By late June, Normandy was no longer a beachhead. It had become an industrial colony fed by the sea. Mulberry harbors stretched into the surf like steel arms. Cranes swung tanks ashore, trucks rolled down floating piers, and rows of barrels glittered under the sun. On June 25th alone, 11,000 tons of supplies came across. They built cities from the sea, a Luftwaffe pilot wrote after flying over Omaha, U.S. National Archives, 1946. The scale broke every German calculation. By the end of June, 600,000 Allied soldiers and 100,000 vehicles crowded Normandy. Ammunition expenditure topped 25,000 tons in a single day. German staff admitted the numbers themselves had become a weapon. Dust filled the air. Engines roared without pause. Nights glowed with flares. For defenders crouched in hedgerows, there was no silence left in France. Panzer Lehr Division tried to counterattack near Tilly-sur-Seulles. For hours, Tigers and Panthers clawed forward, knocking out Shermans. Then, Allied artillery and naval guns answered. More than 250 field pieces and shells from cruisers offshore turned fields into firestorms. Survivors fled. Courage could not compete with mathematics. Reports confirmed it. "Our supplies are inexhaustible. Our men are fresh," one British officer noted. Red Cross Report, 1945. German units shrank into fragments. Companies became platoons. Divisions became battalions. Allied soldiers ate canned meat and drank hot coffee. Germans lived on bread crusts and watery soup. The contrast was not only tactical, it was psychological. Operation Epsom began on June 28th. 60,000 British and Canadian troops surged toward Caen. SS divisions counterattacked with Panthers and Tigers. The fighting tore fields apart. Yet for every tank the Allies lost, reinforcements arrived from the beaches. German armor, once feared, had no replacements. "We were not fighting an army," a captured officer later admitted. "We were fighting a factory that never stopped." U.S. National Archives, 1946. By July 1st, Allied forces numbered nearly 700,000. Their artillery fired more shells in a week than Germany produced in a month. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest the skies. German troops wrote home of endless aircraft overhead, of ground that never stopped shaking. Rommel himself toured the front and told his staff, "We are facing not soldiers, but an industry of war." BBC interview, 1962. On July 7th, Cannes was bombed by 2,000 aircraft. Entire districts disappeared in fire and dust. Survivors called it the fall of the sky. The city burned while British and Canadian troops advanced through rubble. German defenders fought from cellars, but the weight of artillery and armor crushed them yard by yard. By mid-July, Allied strength passed 1 million men, with 200,000 vehicles and 1.5 million tons of supplies. The imbalance was absolute. German divisions shrank to 40% of their strength. Fuel was gone. Artillery fired only a few shells a day. The Allies, by contrast, moved with growing speed, laying airstrips and unloading supplies at rates unmatched in history. A German officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "The invasion cannot be undone. It grows like a storm, and we are the trees." U.S. National Archives, 1946. By July 25th, when Operation Cobra began, the verdict of Normandy was already clear. The day 150,000 Americans had landed was the shock. July was the proof. The invasion was no longer an operation. It was an unstoppable transformation. By late July, the Allied buildup in Normandy had reached its breaking point. More than 1.2 million men and 200,000 vehicles filled the lodgment. The beaches were no longer supply points, but conveyor belts, feeding an army group with endless streams of fuel, ammunition, and food. German generals looked at their maps and realized the hammer was about to fall. Operation Cobra began on July 25th near Saint-Lô. 3,000 aircraft dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs in a single day. The earth heaved, trenches vanished, defenders staggered half-buried and deafened. "It was like the end of the world," one survivor later recalled. Red Cross Report, 1945. When the smoke cleared, American armor surged forward. Within 2 days, the front was broken. The numbers told the truth. By July 27th, American forces poured through a 6-mile gap. Villages once bastions of defense were bypassed. Thousands of prisoners fell into Allied hands. German generals admitted in messages, "We are losing the front." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The psychological collapse was swift. Columns of Shermans rolled like rivers. Dust rose in choking clouds. Engines thundered without pause. German soldiers trudged on foot. Horses dropped dead in ditches. Food was scarce. Fuel nearly gone. For many, retreat meant leaving comrades behind. "It was not a battle," Rommel later said. "It was a flood, and we were drowning." BBC interview, 1962. By early August, Patton's Third Army was unleashed. In 1 week, it advanced nearly 100 miles, capturing towns and bridges at a pace that stunned even Allied commanders. One German officer, captured near Coutances, confessed, "We thought they were tied to beaches. Instead, they moved like rivers." U.S. National Archives, 1946. Hitler demanded counterattacks. Panzers tried at Avranches, but they were smashed by artillery and fighter bombers. Within 48 hours, the attack was annihilated. A German general called it simply suicide. Red Cross Report, 1945. The jaws closed at Falaise. Canadian, British, and American forces pressed inward, trapping the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The pocket became a nightmare. Columns of vehicles jammed the roads, bombed and shelled without pause. Smoke blanketed valleys. The air stank of burning fuel and dead horses. Flies swarmed over wreckage. In Falaise, the Western Front died, a captured officer later admitted. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Between August 12th and 23rd, more than 50,000 Germans were captured, and tens of thousands killed or wounded. Entire divisions ceased to exist. The Allies advanced relentlessly, their supply lines unbroken. German command structures collapsed. Von Kluge took poison. Rommel was already out of the fight, gravely wounded. Rundstedt had been dismissed. What remained of the German command understood the truth. Normandy had destroyed them. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. Patton's tanks had rolled more than 300 miles in 2 weeks. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags as American and French forces entered the city. German generals, once convinced America could not fight, read the reports in silence. In 1940, they had taken France in weeks. In 1944, they had lost it faster. The statistics closed the account. By the end of August, over 2 million Allied soldiers stood in France with nearly 500,000 vehicles. German losses topped 400,000 killed, wounded, or captured. U.S. National Archives, 1946. For every German survivor, the lesson was bitter. The invasion had not just opened a front, it had ended the war in the West. One captured officer explained it in interrogation. "We thought June 6 was the test, but it was only the beginning. The true destruction came in August, when we saw the weight of America and her allies unleashed." Red Cross Report, 1945. The shock of June had become the catastrophe of summer, and nothing could turn it back. By September 1944, the story of Normandy was no longer about beaches or hedgerows. It was about what followed: the collapse of the German Western Front, the industrial weight of America revealed in numbers no general had imagined, and the legacy that stretched far beyond France. For German commanders, the shock of June had transformed into the certainty of defeat by autumn. The scale of Allied success was unprecedented. From June 6 to the end of August, more than 2 million soldiers and nearly 500,000 vehicles had landed in France. Supply totals reached over 4 million tons. Ammunition expenditure in Normandy alone equaled what Germany produced in an entire year. By contrast, German armies had lost over 400,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Their armored strength, once the pride of Europe, was reduced to ruins. The sensory experience matched the arithmetic. Normandy's roads still stank of fuel and smoke weeks after the battles. Villagers described skies that hummed with Allied aircraft even after Paris was liberated. German prisoners marched eastward through liberated towns, the dust of retreat clinging to their uniforms. Allied soldiers, by contrast, lit cigarettes, brewed coffee, and joked about how fast they were driving toward Germany. The industrial lesson was undeniable. America's factories had produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than the Luftwaffe could dream of. Detroit had rolled out 25,000 Sherman tanks in 2 years. Liberty ships launched every 4 days carried supplies across the Atlantic. For German generals, the realization was bitter. The enemy's arsenal was as much a weapon as any soldier. "We fought divisions," one officer admitted in interrogation, "but behind them stood factories without end." Red Cross Report, 1945. The ethics of destruction emerged in debates even then. Geneva Conventions had addressed treatment of prisoners, but not the bombing of cities or the deliberate use of economic might. Was industrial war simply efficiency, or was it a new form of total war? Historians argue still. Some see it as necessity, others as a warning. What is certain is that the soldiers in Normandy lived through its reality, and the generals felt its consequences in every shattered division. The legacy extended across strategy. After Normandy, Hitler could no longer dictate the pace of war in the West. Instead, the Allies dictated events, advancing from France into Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually across the Rhine. German generals who had once written reports predicting Allied collapse now wrote only excuses, explaining why divisions had evaporated. "It was not command failure," one wrote bitterly. "It was impossibility." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The sensory details of legacy were unforgettable. Paris erupted in celebration on August 25th, flags waving, bells ringing. Allied troops tasted wine handed to them in the streets. German survivors who slipped away toward the east described only silence, exhaustion, and shame. The contrast between liberation and retreat underscored the magnitude of what Normandy had begun. Strategically, the Normandy campaign was the true turning point of the Western War. It forced Germany to fight on ground not of its choosing, to stretch its lines, to lose its reserves. More importantly, it proved that American power was not a myth but a reality visible in every ton landed, every road paved, every town liberated. Rommel had once warned that if the Allies gained a permanent foothold, the war was lost. By September, his warning had become prophecy. The numbers speak across decades. By the time Allied forces crossed the Seine, they had advanced over 400 miles in less than 3 months. More than 2,000 bridges had been repaired or built. Over 20,000 aircraft were stationed in France by the autumn. German generals could not match these figures. They had no fuel, no reserves, no time. For them, Normandy was not only a defeat, it was a revelation of inevitability. Captured officers later reflected with a kind of awe. "We laughed at America's soldiers," one said, "but it was not the soldier alone we fought. It was his country, his industry, his sky, his sea. We could not fight them all." BBC interview, 1962. That confession became the epitaph of Normandy. Mockery at the start, silence at the end. For the Allies, the legacy was more than victory. It was proof that logistics, production, and coordination could win wars as surely as courage. Soldiers remembered the sound of convoys rolling without end, the sight of depots filled to bursting, the feel of fresh boots and hot meals even in battle. These details became as much a part of victory as any tank or rifle. By autumn, the question was no longer whether the Allies would reach Germany. It was only when. Normandy had been the gate. The rest of the continent lay open. German generals who once plotted offensives now plotted only survival. Their underestimation of June 6th had written their defeat in August and September. One figure captures the legacy. In the 85 days after D-Day, the Allies advanced farther, with more men and equipment than Germany had advanced in the same ground in 1940. The difference was not only tactical, it was historical. Normandy marked the end of German dominance in Europe and the rise of industrial war as the defining force of the 20th century. The final lesson is not found in tonnage or divisions alone. It is found in the realization that the war was decided not just by battles, but by capacity. The day 150,000 men landed stunned German generals. The months that followed destroyed their armies, and the legacy that remains is clear. The future belonged not to those who underestimated, but to those who prepared.